The mansion was filled with family photographs in golden frames that lined the hallway walls. Pictures of smiling couples, graduation ceremonies, vacations in exotic locations, but in every recent photo, one thing was missing: the sound of a child's laughter. 7-year-old Oliver stood in the grand living room, his light brown hair falling across his forehead. He wore a navy blue shirt with colorful dots, and his big blue eyes watched the world with an intensity that broke his father's heart. Oliver had been born deaf, complete hearing loss that no amount of money or medical expertise had been able to fix. His father, James Thornton, was one of the wealthiest men in the state. He stood now in the doorway wearing an expensive navy suit, watching his son. James had tried everything: the best doctors in New York, London, Switzerland, experimental treatments that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nothing worked. And with each failure, James felt himself becoming more desperate, more angry at a world where his money could not buy his son the one thing he needed most: the ability to hear. 3 months ago, James had hired Simone as Oliver's caretaker. She was a young woman in her late 20s with dark skin and kind eyes. She wore the traditional uniform with a white collar and cuffs, her hair pulled back neatly in a bun. But there was something different about Simone, something that made Oliver smile in ways he had not smiled in years. She had grown up in a small village where her younger brother had also been born deaf. She knew sign language fluently, but more than that, she understood what it meant to communicate beyond words, to see a child for who they were, not for what they lacked. James had been skeptical at first, another caretaker who would promise connection and then leave when the job became too difficult. But Simone had stayed, and slowly, quietly, she had become the bridge between James and his son. This particular afternoon, Oliver had been playing with his toys when he suddenly stopped. His small hand went to his ear, and his face twisted in discomfort. Simone noticed immediately. She knelt beside him, her movements calm and gentle. Oliver pointed to his ear and made a sound of distress. James rushed over, his heart pounding. "What's wrong? Is he hurt?" Simone held up a hand, asking for patience. She turned Oliver's head gently, examining his ear in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Then she saw it. Something dark lodged deep in Oliver's ear canal. James leaned in, his face pale. "What is that? Should I call the doctor?" "Mr. Thornton," Simone said quietly, "I think I can help, but I need you to trust me." She pulled something small from her pocket, a pair of precision tweezers that she kept in her medical kit. James's eyes widened. "You can't just— we should call a specialist." "Sir," Simone said, meeting his eyes, "in my village we did not always have access to specialists. Sometimes we had to help each other. I have done this before for my brother. Please let me try." There was something in her voice, a quiet confidence that made James step back and nod. Simone turned to Oliver and signed to him, explaining what she was going to do. The boy watched her hands, then nodded, trusting her completely. With steady hands and infinite patience, Simone carefully extracted something from Oliver's ear. It was small and dark. A bead, one of those tiny decorative beads that had somehow gotten lodged deep in his ear canal weeks or maybe even months ago. No one had known it was there. The doctors had run their tests and scans, but this simple obstruction had been missed. As Simone pulled it free, Oliver's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in shock, and then he did something he had never done before. He turned his head toward the grandfather. Clock in the corner, the one that chimed every hour. It chimed now, and Oliver's face transformed. His eyes filled with tears. His small hands went to his ears as if he could not believe what he was experiencing. "Dad?" he said. His voice was uncertain, unused but clear. James froze. His son had just spoken, had just called him Dad. Not in sign language, but out loud. Oliver turned toward his father, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, I can hear you." James dropped to his knees, his own tears coming fast. "You can hear me? Oliver, you can hear me?" The boy nodded frantically and launched himself into his father's arms. They held each other, both crying, both laughing. Simone stood quietly to the side, the small bead still held in her tweezers. James looked up at her, his face awash with emotions he could not name. "How did you know?" "I did not know," Simone admitted. "But when he pointed to his ear with such distress, something told me to look closer. In my village, children would sometimes push small objects into their ears or noses. It happened to my brother once, a pebble. He could not hear for weeks until my grandmother removed it. James stood, still holding Oliver. You just gave me back my son's hearing. Do you understand that? Years of specialists, millions of dollars, and it was something so simple. Simone smiled gently. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we overlook. We assume that big problems need complicated solutions, but sometimes they just need someone willing to look closely and care deeply. Over the following weeks, Oliver's world exploded with sound. He heard birds singing for the first time, heard music, really heard it, and danced around the living room with pure joy. Heard his father say, "I love you," and could say it back. The specialist confirmed what seemed like a miracle. Oliver's hearing was perfect. It had always been perfect. The bead had been lodged so deeply and for so long that every test had indicated permanent hearing loss. But now it was gone, and with it, years of silence. James sat in his office one evening, looking at the small bead that Simone had placed in a tiny glass container. Such a small thing to have such enormous impact. He thought about all the money he had spent, all the experts he had consulted, and how the answer had come from a young woman who earned a modest salary and kept precision tweezers in her pocket because she had grown up in a place where you learned to help yourself and others. He called Simone into his office. She came in, still in her uniform, a little nervous about the formal summons. "Simone," James said, "I need to tell you something. When I hired you, I thought you were just another caretaker, someone to watch Oliver while I worked. I was wrong." He stood and walked around his desk. "You did not just care for my son. You saw him, really saw him, and because you did, you noticed something that dozens of specialists missed. You gave him back something I thought was lost forever." James pulled out an envelope. "This is a check. It is more money than your annual salary. But more importantly, I want to offer you a new position, not as a caretaker, but as director of a foundation I am starting, a foundation to help children with hearing difficulties, especially in communities that do not have access to expensive specialists." Simone's eyes widened. "Mr. Thornton, I do not have formal qualifications for something like that." "You have something better," James said. "You have experience, compassion, and wisdom. You know that sometimes the most valuable knowledge does not come from universities. It comes from communities, where people take care of each other, where they pass down understanding from generation to generation." He smiled. "Besides, we will get you any training you need. But your heart, your eye, instinct to look closer when others looked away, that cannot be taught." Simone accepted, tears in her eyes. The foundation launched 6 months later. It provided free hearing examinations, including careful checks for obstructions that might be missed by standard tests. It trained community health workers in villages and underserved areas. It created partnerships between expensive specialists and local caregivers. And it was all inspired by one small bead and one woman who cared enough to look closely. Years later, Oliver was a teenager, thriving in school, playing piano and speaking multiple languages. He volunteered at the foundation every summer, and he always told people the same story, about the day his life changed, not because of wealth or technology or famous doctors, but because someone saw him as a person worth paying attention to, someone who brought simple tools and profound care, someone who understood that sometimes miracles look like ordinary kindness. James never forgot the lesson either, that being rich meant having resources, but being wise meant knowing when to step back and let someone with different knowledge step forward, that the most valuable thing you can give someone is not money, but attention, patience, and the willingness to see what others miss, and that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the smallest acts of care, from a pair of tweezers in a pocket, from a memory of helping a brother in a faraway village, from looking closely when it would be easier to look away. If this story reminded you that wisdom comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes the simplest solutions require the deepest care, please like, share, and subscribe.